Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a stack of your sources and plunging into something pretty universal, something that definitely touches all our lives. Stress.
Yeah, it really does.
Our mission here is to sort of unpack these sources together, pull out the most important knowledge, the practical insights, really, to help you understand your own stress response and maybe build some resilience.
And it's true, stress isn't some brand new modern problem. The core of it, our brain's ancient response, fight, flight, or freeze, that's been with us forever. It's what helped our ancestors survive, actual physical threats, lions and things.
Right. And the source points out that little almond-shaped bit deep in your brain, the amygdala, it evolved specifically to sound that alarm based on what it perceives as a threat.
Exactly. It gets signals from your senses, your internal organs, and then bam, it triggers hormones, neurotransmitters, basically prepping your body for immediate physical action.
But the tricky part today, as the sources highlight, is that this incredibly effective, hardwired, automatic response, well, it's often totally mismatched with the stressors we face now.
Totally. Things like bills or, a demanding boss, sitting stuck in traffic.
Yeah.
These don't require you to physically fight or run away. They need, problem solving, patience, managing complex stuff.
So when our brain hits that ancient alarm for these modern challenges, you might find yourself reacting in ways that aren't actually helpful, like numbing out with food, maybe, or zoning out on screen.
Or just driving yourself so hard you just burn out completely. And importantly, the sources are really clear on this. We shouldn't blame ourselves for these reactions.
Yeah.
It's not a failing. Our brain is just running its ancient program, designed for a world where threats were physical and you needed to do something physical right now.
That makes a lot of sense. So if you're feeling constantly wound up, maybe irritable, panicky, or you find yourself just avoiding things,
Yeah.
it's probably because that ancient system is signaling survival threat, even when there isn't any actual physical danger.
Yeah, your brain might be reacting as if it needs to prep you for some extreme action that honestly just isn't appropriate for paying a bill or dealing with your boss.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit more then. This built-in stress response, centered around the amygdala. It's really optimized for concrete physical danger, isn't it?
Absolutely. When it perceives a threat, and that could be real or even just imagined, it kicks off this whole cascade. Physiological changes, hormones like cortisol and adrenaline flooding your system. It's all designed to get you ready for immediate fight or flight.
And that explains why, when you're stressed about something abstract, like a deadline or maybe a difficult conversation you need to have, you might feel those same physical things. Racing heart, sweaty palms, feeling totally keyed up.
Exactly. Your body is physically getting ready to run or fight, but you're probably just sitting at your desk, right?
Yeah.
The brain's signaling survival threat. The body's prepping for intense action.
But the action isn't helpful.
Right. The sources suggest if modern challenges feel overwhelmingly stressful for you, it could be because your brain is interpreting them through this very old lens, signaling danger, prepping you for action that's just, it's the wrong tool for the job.
Okay, so ancient wiring meets modern life, and things get complicated. The sources seem to break down different kinds of stressors and how they impact us. First up, they talk about developmental transitions.
Yeah, these are those life changes tied to specific stages, like going to college, getting married, starting a new job, retiring, that kind of thing. They inherently require adaptation, so they can be stressful, but often they have positive sides too.
The sources gave that example, Yan versus Wendy starting college.
Yeah.
Yan had a pretty smooth time, right? Loved the school, major, got along with her roommate.
Found a decent part-time job, had fun. Yeah, she missed home, sure, but she felt fulfilled, adjusted well. But compare that to Wendy.
Right, Wendy went to a school that wasn't her first choice, struggled with classes, felt isolated, shy, had money worries. Her transition sounds much tougher.
Much tougher. And the sources point to why. Things like how much choice you had in the change, your own adaptability, what you feel like you're losing from your old life roles, relationships, and crucially, how well your skills match the new demands.
Okay, and the key takeaway is that these transitions, while stressful, are often more temporary, and maybe you have a bit more control compared to other stressors.
Generally, yeah. They offer more room for personal control, usually. Which brings us to the next category, which can be quite a bit more challenging, major life events.
Okay, so these are the big ones. Significant things involving failure, threat, or really profound loss, like job loss, divorce, serious illness, the death of someone close.
Exactly. These cause massive upheaval. They stir up really strong, difficult emotions, anger, fear, deep sadness, and they require a huge amount of coping effort.
And it's not just the tangible loss like money or status, is it?
Yeah.
It's also the abstract stuff, your sense of certainty, maybe feeling safe, your confidence.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really impactful physiologically. The sources state clearly that these major events don't just feel bad emotionally. They can actually make you physically vulnerable.
How so?
Well, they're linked to a higher risk of getting sick, common stuff like colds, flu, but also significantly increase your likelihood of developing depression or anxiety disorders.
Wow. And they can even, what was it, sensitize the amygdala, make you jumpier.
Yeah, exactly. You might become more reactive to just everyday annoyances, things
Yep.
that normally wouldn't faze you.
The source had that example, Ted. Despite having good skills, savings,
Huh.
just the possibility of losing his job sent him into a panic.
Right. And the source explanation was fascinating. His brain was basically conditioned by stress in his childhood to see any uncertainty as this massive, overwhelming threat. It bypassed his rational thinking completely.
So his amygdala just went into overdrive over a possibility. And his prefrontal cortex, the thinking part, instead of calming him down, actually dredged up old abandonment fears from childhood, making the fear even bigger.
It's a powerful illustration. Another one was Becky dealing with a breakup. The source mentioned her childhood neglect had sort of primed her brain for chronic stress.
Leading to that frozen, stuck state.
Exactly. Stuck. Couldn't move forward. It showed up as obsessive thinking, physical symptoms like headaches, fatigue, worsened by drinking more alcohol too.
It really underscores what the source says about how fundamental connection is for us. Our brains are wired for it, and loss or rejection gets perceived by that ancient system as a really serious survival stressor.
Definitely. And digging into job loss specifically, the source highlights just how much it impacts identity, self-worth. It affects the whole family, creates this chronic stress environment.
They mentioned some groups might be more vulnerable too, like millennials, older workers.
Yeah, workers over 50 were mentioned specifically. But the coping strategies discussed are interesting because they focus on resilience beyond just the job situation.
And like maintaining routines, trying to be optimistic, leaning on support.
Right, and finding your identity and core values, seeing yourself as a good parent, a loving partner, whatever it is for you, rather than tying your entire self-worth to that job title you lost.
Okay. Then we get to chronic stressors. These are the ones that just grind you down, right? Repeated, continuous stuff in important areas of life.
Yeah, like a difficult marriage, ongoing parenting challenges, persistent problems at work, managing a long-term illness. The stuff that just doesn't seem to end.
Caregiving came up specifically, didn't it, as a major chronic stressor linked to immune system issues, inflammation.
Yes, impaired immunity and inflammation. But what's really interesting there is the source notes that how you view your role matters. If you see it as meaningful, maybe an expression of love or loyalty, that can actually buffer some of the negative physical effects. Your mindset makes a difference.
That's powerful. Work stress was another big one. They mentioned that famous Whitehall 2-sex study.
Yeah, the Whitehall study. It found, maybe counterintuitively, that it wasn't always the top executives with the most stress. Often it was workers in lower status jobs.
The ones with high demands but low control, like the administrative assistant example.
Exactly. High demands, tight deadlines, but maybe no control over resources or how the work gets done. That combination seems particularly stressful.
And then loneliness. This was fascinating. The brain interprets loneliness as a chronic stressor, like a physical threat.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
Triggering that same fight, flight, freeze response. There's even research mentioned showing that in lonely people, genes that promote inflammation are more active.
Wow. Which might help explain why loneliness is linked to so many health problems. The sources really emphasize connection, community. Nurturing relationships as a buffer.
Absolutely crucial. Then you have the daily hassles. Minor stuff, right? Traffic, chores, tech glitches, difficult colleagues.
The little things that just constantly poke at you.
Yeah, they trigger low-level stress responses. And while some people seem to bounce back fine, for others, these can really add up. They can sensitize your system over time, leading to stronger, maybe disproportionate reactions to small things.
And finally, the sources talked about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs and trauma, events before age 18, abuse, neglect, major family issues, loss, bullying.
Right. The sources indicate these experiences can fundamentally disrupt how the brain manages stress chemicals. They can make the amygdala more sensitive, more reactive.
And crucially, impair the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate that response.
Exactly, which can leave you much more reactive to stress now as an adult. The source specifically flags that if you've experienced 3 or more ACEs, learning effective stress management becomes particularly vital.
So you can really see how these different types of stress, especially if they pile up or interact, can make that amygdala alarm system just louder and harder to turn off over time.
Which leads us directly into the long-term physiological impact of all this chronic stress. The sources detail some significant effects on your body and brain.
Yeah, in the brain itself, prolonged stress hormones can mess with how cells use glucose, make them more vulnerable.
That's right. And excess cortisol in particular can actually damage the hippocampus. That's the part vital for memory, learning, and importantly, mood regulation.
And it's not just damage, is it? The sources said it strengthens the wrong connections, like between the amygdala and hippocampus, training the brain for emergencies.
Exactly. It reinforces those emergency preparedness pathways, but at the same time, it weakens the links to your prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking part. So your ability to regulate the stress response with logic gets reduced.
So basically, too much stress makes your brain more reactive and less able to calm itself down logically. That sounds like a really tough cycle.
It is. And chronic stress is also strongly linked to weight gain. After that initial adrenaline spike wears off, cortisol signals your body to refuel, right? For the fight that never happened.
Which increases appetite, often for those comfort foods. High fat, high sugar.
Yep. Plus, stress messes with sleep. And when you're tired, your willpower takes a hit, making unhealthy food choices more likely.
And over time, that constant stress encourages the body to store fat, especially that dangerous belly fat, the apple shape, linked to heart disease risk.
That's the connection the sources make. They suggest if you struggle with emotional eating or hitting weight loss plateaus, chronic stress could be a big underlying factor, and that stress reduction techniques might actually help you lose belly fat naturally.
Then there's aging. Telomeres, the cellular aging markers. They're sensitive to stress, too.
Highly sensitive to chronic stress. They mention a really compelling study on mothers caring for kids with chronic disabilities.
Right. The ones who felt more stressed had shorter telomeres, like years of extra aging.
Equivalent to 10 or more years of extra aging compared to the less stressed moms in the study. It's quite stark.
But this also raises that crucial point from the sources.
Yeah.
How you view your stress genuinely matters, doesn't it?
It really seems to. Perceiving your stress as less burdensome, maybe finding meaning in it, appears to offer some protection against these negative cellular effects. It's fascinating.
Okay, so we've painted the picture. Ancient brain, modern stressors, significant impacts. Now let's get into the solutions, the strategies the sources offer for building a more stress-proof brain.
Yeah.
Part 1 seems to focus on calming the amygdala itself, tackling the fear and panic.
Exactly. Cooling down that immediate fear response. And mindfulness is presented as a key antidote here.
So not just meditation, but more like an attitude. Open, compassionate towards your inner stuff.
Yeah, it's about cultivating that attitude, creating some distance, some space between you and your stressful thoughts and feelings so you have room to choose your response instead of just reacting automatically. They mention John Kabat-Zinn, of course, and how effective mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, has been, even for things like chronic pain.
And how does it actually help with the stress response itself?
Well, it literally slows things down. It gives your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part, a chance to step in and regulate. And crucially, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system.
The rest and digest system.
That's the one. It actively calms your body's fight, flight, or freeze physiology, slows your heart rate, your breathing. It's like sending a physiological signal. Okay, the danger has passed.
So what does being in a mindful state actually feel like, according to the sources?
It's about being deliberate, purposeful, really focused in your attention, taking an observer stance. You know, that idea of you are the sky, thoughts and feelings are just clouds passing through.
Replacing fear with curiosity, like, what's that thought?
Exactly. And practicing openness, non-judgment. Avoiding that second arrow of suffering that comes when you start judging yourself for feeling stressed or anxious.
Are there specific practices mentioned?
Simple ones, yeah. Breath awareness meditation, just focusing on the sensation of your breath, maybe in your nostrils, chest, belly. Sensory awareness is another, really tuning into your senses. Sight, sound, smell, touch, even internal body feelings, maybe doing this while walking outside or just focusing intently on an object.
And the point is consistent practice, right? To integrate it into daily life.
That's the key. It's not just about the formal meditation time. It's about bringing that awareness into everyday moments.
Okay. Another big strategy for the amygdala seems to be facing, accepting emotions, which sounds kind of scary.
It can sound scary, yeah. But the sources are really clear. You can't successfully push difficult emotions down. They're hardwired. They will come back, often stronger, because the amygdala keeps signaling problem until you actually listen to the message.
People worry they'll get overwhelmed, right? The feeling will take over and never leave.
That's a common fear. But the sources counter that by describing emotions as temporary. They're passing events in your mind and body, not permanent states.
So what's the benefit of acceptance then, if suppression backfires?
Well, acceptance is about acknowledging what's already present. Remember, the brain's connections from emotion areas to thinking areas are stronger than the other way around. Trying to suppress feelings, especially when you're stressed, just doesn't work well. You get that rebound effect.
Okay.
Acceptance lets you separate the raw emotion itself from all the negative judgments you pile on top of it, like, I hate feeling this way, or I shouldn't feel this.
Are there specific practices for acceptance?
Yeah, metaphors are helpful here. Like surfing the wave, you can't stop the waves of emotion, but you can learn to ride them out. Visualizing the emotion in your body and maybe trying to mentally soften its edges or lighten its color or shrink it down.
Nature imagery, too, like a pond or the sky.
Exactly. Picturing your mind like a vast sky where feelings like clouds just drift through, it helps you observe them without getting totally swept away by them.
And then there's expressing your emotions, finding safe ways to let them out.
Critically important. Could be drawing, journaling, talking to someone you trust, a friend, therapist. James Pennebaker's expressive writing technique is highlighted specifically.
Oh yeah, the writing intervention. The research on that sounds really compelling. Writing about deep thoughts and feelings for just 20, 30 minutes, a few days in a row.
Exactly. Creating a narrative around a stressful event. And the research shows it has tangible benefits. People tend to stay healthier, feel better emotionally, and even take more positive action in their lives.
They mentioned it even helped laid-off engineers find jobs faster.
That's one of the findings, yeah. So why does it work? The source suggests it helps you overcome avoidance, helps clarify what you're actually feeling and needing, gives the amygdala a sense of coherence because you've created a story.
Offers a new perspective.
Offers a new perspective, grounds the amygdala, and lets you process difficult stuff in manageable doses. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Okay, powerful tools for calming the amygdala. Now let's shift to part 2. Using your prefrontal cortex. Engaging the thinking brain to get control and change perspective.
Right, and the sources really hammer home the link between losing control over stressors and increased risk for stress and depression.
Things you feel totally powerless about trigger that fight-flight response more intensely.
Exactly. Animal studies show this very clearly. When there's no perceived escape or way to influence the outcome, the stress response is stronger and more damaging.
And experiencing uncontrollable stress, especially in childhood, can actually damage the PFC's ability to regulate the amygdala later on.
That's what the sources indicate. It can impair that top-down regulation. So you might be more reactive, partly because the part of your brain designed to put the brakes on isn't functioning optimally. Plus, the amygdala tends to overgeneralize stress about one thing makes you anxious about unrelated things. You need the PFC to step in and say, hold on, this is different.
So engaging the PFC is key for building stress resilience. And this is where that inoculation effect comes in, right? That experiencing some stress can actually make you stronger.
Yeah, it's really interesting research. The series study mentioned found that people who had experienced a moderate amount of adversity in their lives actually reported less stress and better functioning in response to later life events compared to people who had experienced very little adversity.
Like getting a vaccine for stress.
Kind of. Overcoming manageable challenges seems to build psychological muscle and confidence for future challenges.
It reminds me of that classic nursing home study, too, where residents given just a little bit of control, like caring for a plant.
Yeah. They showed better health, better mood, even lived longer than residents who didn't have that sense of control. It really underscores how much your perception of control matters for your long-term well-being.
So practically, how do you gain that sense of control when stressed? The sources mentioned building confidence.
Yes, things like consciously assessing your skills and past successes, identifying coping strategies you've used before that worked, looking at how others have handled similar situations, learning from your own history. And, crucially, focusing on the aspects you can control.
Breaking tasks down.
Yeah.
Scheduling time.
Exactly. Making the problem feel more manageable by focusing on concrete actions within your power.
Which then leads to the necessary flip side, letting go of what you can't control. Because some things are just outside our influence, right?
Absolutely. Other people's actions, the economy, the weather, stress can make us spin our wheels, ruminating endlessly on these uncontrollable factors.
And that rumination is just pointless, isn't it? Wastes energy, drags down your mood, keeps you stressed without any solution.
Totally counterproductive. So the sources suggest a practice like mentally putting things you can't control into a container.
Visualizing it.
Yeah. Visualize those worries going into a sealed box or container, maybe mentally storing it away, and consciously setting an intention to redirect your focus and energy onto the things you can influence your effort, your response.
Recognizing you can't always control the outcome, but you can control your actions and how you react.
Precisely. And focusing on controlling the impact that the stressor has on you. Maybe you can't cure chronic pain, but you can control staying active. Maybe you can't guarantee job security, but you can control being a good parent. Finding ways to maintain well-being despite the uncontrollable elements.
You can control what you do, even if not always what you think or feel initially.
That's a key insight.
Okay, on to part 3. Changing your thinking. Stress can make our thinking really rigid or sometimes just chaotic.
Yeah, the sources talk about less integrated brains having less coordinated responses. It can manifest as rigidity, like focusing only on logic, trying to fix things without acknowledging feelings, getting stuck in strategies that aren't working.
Like the Betty example. Trying harder and harder in her marriage when maybe the situation needed a different approach entirely.
Exactly. Or it can look chaotic, feeling completely overwhelmed, falling into avoidance, maybe using addictive behaviors to cope. Like Peggy, the administrative assistant, who got overwhelmed and just zoned out with TV and alcohol.
And therapy helped both of them develop cognitive flexibility, the ability to see things differently and try new ways of coping.
That's the idea. Learning to shift perspectives, consider alternatives, adapt your approach. But stress itself can actually decrease this flexibility. It makes us cling to old habits, even unhelpful ones. They even mention studies with infants showing this.
So how do you deliberately learn cognitive flexibility? The sources laid out a kind of process, didn't they?
Yeah, it involves several steps. First, clearly describe the stressor. Then examine how you currently see it. Is it a threat, a challenge, a loss? Actively try to reframe it, maybe see it as a challenge if possible. Clarify your priorities and goals in the situation.
Assess what's controllable versus uncontrollable.
Right. Evaluate your current coping strategies. Are they actually working? Be honest. Identify why you might be sticking to old ways, even if they're not helpful. Consider other people's perspectives. Could compromise or setting boundaries help?
And then brainstorm and commit to trying new strategies, anticipating potential barriers. It sounds like a very deliberate PFC-driven process.
It is. It requires conscious effort. Another big thinking trap is overcoming worry and rumination. The sources make a distinction here.
Worry can sometimes be productive, like mental problem solving for uncertain outcomes, but rumination is different.
Exactly. Rumination is that persistent, repetitive loop of worry that doesn't generate any new insights or solutions. Like a cow chewing cud, as the source puts it. It's unhelpful, it ramps up stress, and it makes you feel worse.
And it can even damage relationships, because friends and family get tired of hearing the same loop.
That's a point the source makes, yeah. Your amygdala hates unresolved problems, so it keeps bringing them back up, but the rumination itself doesn't solve anything.
So how do you break that cycle? Thought stopping was mentioned, like snapping an elastic band.
Yeah, or mentally shouting, "Stop!" Visualizing a stop sign, dedicating a specific limited time and place for the worry chair idea, noticing and avoiding your personal rumination triggers, whether it's certain people or maybe late night scrolling.
And that CBT technique, decatastrophizing.
Right, decatastrophizing and probability estimation. Asking yourself, what's the absolute worst that could happen? What's the best? What's most likely or realistic? And then crucially, asking, could I cope with the realistic outcome? It helps challenge the amygdala's tendency to jump straight to the worst case scenario.
And finally, within thinking patterns, there's overcoming negative thinking more broadly, those common distortions stress brings out.
Yeah, things like pessimism, always seeing the glass half empty, overthinking and second-guessing everything until you feel paralyzed. Personalizing, taking too much blame when things go wrong.
How do you counter that? Asking how an objective observer might see it. Remembering stress is universal.
Exactly. Avoiding harsh blaming of yourself or others, recognizing multiple factors are usually involved, resisting the urge to compare your insides to other people's curated outsides, and becoming aware of that harsh inner critic, the judging mind.
The source used the Sue example too. Her hypervigilance about her boyfriend cheating, possibly fueled by stress, might have actually contributed to the breakup.
Yeah, it suggests that constant vigilance, that scanning for threats, can create its own problems. Your brain needs rest, not constant alert status. Building supportive relationships is presented as a really powerful buffer against a lot of these negative thought patterns, too.
Okay, that covers the mental strategies. Let's wrap up with part 4, building healthy habits and mindset. Because chronic stress often pushes us towards unhealthy behaviors, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Living healthy in the face of stress means first recognizing those links. We talked about stress, cortisol, and weight gain, how it drives appetite for unhealthy foods. Stress also fuels emotional eating, using food to numb feelings, or mindless eating when you're distracted or sedentary.
Alcohol use came up again, too. Stress often leads to more drinking, especially noted in men. Short-term fix, long-term problem, right?
Big time. It adds more physiological stress, more wear and tear, creating a really vicious cycle when combined with the initial chronic stress. The sources even provide definitions for what constitutes heavy drinking.
And sleep. Stress is terrible for sleep, that hyperarousal state.
Fundamentally disrupts the balance needed for sleep, and lack of sleep is itself a major chronic stressor. It tanks your mood, focus, willpower, makes you crave carbs. It's a mess.
That lifespan study was interesting, 6.5 to 7.5 hours being the sweet spot.
That's what the cited study suggested, yeah. And the sources strongly advise against relying on sleeping pills, long-term addiction risk, grogginess, better to address the root causes.
So strategies focus on things like reducing caffeine and alcohol, especially later in the day.
Definitely. Increasing natural melatonin by ensuring your bedroom is really dark, keeping your head cool, lower thermostat, maybe a splash of cold water.
And having a solid, relaxing bedtime routine, like a bath, calming music, maybe meditation.
Yes, signaling to your body that it's time to wind down. And that advice about getting out of bed if you're just lying there awake for 15 minutes, doing something quiet elsewhere until you feel sleepy again, that's solid sleep hygiene.
Progressive muscle relaxation was mentioned too. Tensing and releasing muscles.
Yeah, that's highlighted as a proven technique for triggering the relaxation response, which is obviously helpful before trying to sleep.
Okay, and eating healthier. This ties back to emotional eating, right? Using food to stuff down feelings.
Often stems from that suppression we talked about earlier, so the antidote suggested is mindful eating.
Really paying attention. Eating slowly, savoring, no multitasking.
Exactly. Tuning into the actual sensations, taste, texture, smell, and listening to your body's hunger and fullness cues. The apple slice example illustrates this well. Also, practical tips like having a regular meal schedule, keeping healthy snacks handy, cutting back on alcohol. Essentially, using healthier stress management tools instead of food or booze to unwind.
Makes sense. And finally, the sources emphasize finding the right mindset. How you think about stress matters hugely.
It really does. One powerful mindset is actively cultivating a stress as beneficial perspective.
Seeing it as a chance for growth or learning, not just harmful, like the caregiving mothers study.
Precisely. Those mothers who found meaning in their challenging roles seem protected from some negative effects. And remembering that inoculation idea, exposure to manageable stress, can make you stronger. Viewing stress as enhancing life or being meaningful seems key.
Becoming gritty was another mindset. Determination, mental toughness for long-term goals.
Yeah, tied to psychological hardiness, that combination of commitment, seeing challenges as opportunities, and maintaining a sense of control. Passion helps you persist. Seeing stress as a challenge, not just a threat, calms the amygdala and builds hope, and focusing on what you can control directs your energy effectively.
And self-compassion seemed really important too. Being kind to yourself when you mess up or struggle.
Absolutely vital. Recognizing that suffering and imperfection are just part of being human. The source emphasizes this isn't weakness. It actually decreases anxiety and stress, enhances resilience. It helps you adapt better to life's inevitable bumps and disappointments. It's like learning to be a good, supportive parent to yourself, rewiring your brain for kindness over criticism.
Okay, so bringing this whole deep dive together. The core message from all these sources seems pretty clear. Stress is this unavoidable ancient response, often really ill-suited for modern life, but crucially, you're not helpless against it.
Definitely not. You have these powerful tools. You can learn to calm that reactive amygdala mindfulness, accepting emotions. You can engage your prefrontal cortex, gaining control, thinking flexibly, challenging those negative thoughts.
You can build those healthy habits, exercise, sleep, mindful eating that physically buffer your brain and body.
And you can consciously cultivate helpful mindsets, self-compassion, grit, maybe even seeing stress as a catalyst for growth.
It's not an overnight fix, though. The sources are clear. This takes time, consistent practice, months, maybe not days.
For sure, it's about retraining your brain. But the potential outcome, according to these sources, is really profound. It's about becoming the CEO of your own brain.
We're taking charge instead of letting the amygdala run the show.
Exactly, shifting from being ruled by fear and pessimism towards more openness, hope, curiosity, even creativity.
And that shift is ultimately linked to better health, more happiness, stronger relationships, more success, just navigating life's challenges more effectively. You can't avoid stress, but you absolutely can learn to handle it differently.
And considering that even really small shifts, small changes in how you perceive things, how you respond, the little practices you adopt each day, they really can start to rewire your brain's stress response over time.
So the final thought for you to consider is, what's one small, manageable practice from everything we've talked about in this deep dive that you could realistically try integrating into your day, starting now?